at Cornerstone for this semester, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And then he says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly of heart, and you will find rest for your souls." You know, yoke is something that in the United States we don't think much about. In other countries where they have equipment, modern equipment, they don't think much about it either. But in Jesus' time, a yoke was really important because it meant a shared load. And it's interesting to me that when he asked people to come to him, that the people that he connects to are people that he describes as weary and heavy laden, exhausted, spent. And he said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and lowly, and you will find rest for your souls." And we've been talking about the last couple of weeks what that means to be in harness with Jesus as we deal with our families. And many of us have so many different kinds of experiences with our families. Some of them are good. Some of us look with fondness over the times that we grew up. Times that we have great memories. Memories of laughter, memories of trips, and memories of great adventures with our families. Memories of dealing with our siblings, brothers and sisters, and those bring smiles to our faces, and we have wonderful memories of that. Some of us, not so much. Some of us have memories that we want to forget. Memories of abuse. Memories of verbal abuse and physical abuse. Memories of divorce. Memories of being made to choose between mother and father. Memories of blended families that we didn't expect to happen to us. And so for us, family time and interacting with family is not like others of us here who experience wonderful memories. I can't remember much about my family when I was a little kid. I don't know if you can or not. I don't even start remembering about my family until I was like 3 or 4 years old. And does that mean that all those years before I begin to remember were lost? Not at all. Admiral William H. McCraven, who was the president of the University of Texas, he was a Navy SEAL and the head of the Navy SEALs of all the United States, gave a speech at commencement at UT. And in this speech, he talked about that everything happens at the speed of war. I don't know if you've ever heard much or thought much about the speed of war, but it happens fast and it's instantaneous. And Admiral McCraven said in his speech, "If you want to change the world, start by making your bed." Now that just doesn't seem to be in the same category of changing the world. And he says the reason for that is because you need to start off the day by accomplishing a task. It reinforces that little things matter. Do the little things to get ready for the big things. And then the Navy SEALs, they teach that every person counts. They have these boats composed of recruits, and they discovered that the boat with the recruits who were under 5'5", despite their size advantage, was by far the best boat, because every person counts. And you never know the measure of people until they're tested. Then he said that we need to all learn to be uncomfortable. And there's nothing like a family to make that happen. You measure a person by the size of his or her heart. And I began to think in my own personal life about moments in my family that I remember. And I don't know if you've ever done an inventory like that in your life, but a lot of my memories have to do with pain. In my family, every member of our family had stitches in our chins. And my parents had to take us to the ER. And at the time, I didn't understand what an inconvenience that was. My mom and my dad had to drop everything they were doing. They had to get us in the car. They had to run to ER. They had to put up with our screaming and yelling as they numbed our chins so that they could stitch it up. And then they had to go home, and now they had to deal with a kid who had a bandaged chin and had to deal with all those kinds of things. But I didn't think at the time what an inconvenience that was to my mom and dad, who had their days planned out, who had every minute spoken for, and all of a sudden they had to rearrange their schedule, rearrange their plans because their kid cut his chin. I didn't understand when I was standing on the couch, watching my brother count money, leaning on to the room divider, that when the room divider moved and I came crashing to the floor, cutting my head, that my mother and my dad had to rearrange the rest of their schedule for the day to take me to the emergency room to get my head stitched up. It never dawned on me that they had to make all these arrangements and plans and rearrange everything because Ronnie was a klutz again. You have to learn to be uncomfortable. And so I want to talk about families today, and I want to talk to you about it in a way that maybe you've not thought about before. Number one, God provides children to families for His purposes, not yours. Well, but we need somebody to mow the grass, and we need somebody to do the laundry, and we need somebody to empty the trash, and we need somebody to make the beds and to dust, so let's have kids. Good luck. God provides kids for His purposes, not for yours. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 and 31, Moses writes this, "And God blessed them, Adam and Eve. And God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth.' And God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day." God's original plan for the family was for making babies. But it was more than that. It wasn't just for making biological babies. It was for making worshipers of Him. And so when you read in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. These people had dutifully replenished the earth, but with the wrong kind of people. These people couldn't think a good thought. They could only think evil thoughts. And so it's obvious that God has in mind, more than people just having babies, that God has in mind that these children, these babies, should grow up to be conscious of Him and to worship Him and to honor Him. That He wants the family to produce children that praise Him. And so after the flood, after God destroyed the earth and Noah and his sons were left, 9 people, then God instructs them again. And you be fruitful and multiply and increase greatly on the earth. And so they had kids and more kids and more kids. And guess what? They produced sinners just like before. We're good at producing sinners. We're great at it. What's hard is to produce children who worship God, who honor Him, and who praise Him, and who appreciate Him, and are conscious of Him. And so it shouldn't surprise us that when we get to the New Testament, and Jesus is born into a family, that Mark writes these words in Mark chapter 6, verses 3 through 6. Is not this the carpenter, speaking of Jesus, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? Which means that Mary and Joseph, after Jesus was born, they had several more children. Now, if you count them up, there's 4 brothers, and there's sisters, plural, which means that Jesus was in a family of 7 kids. 7. But Mark goes on and says this, and they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, these are his hometown folks, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. Now notice what he says next. And among his relatives. But then he goes on. And in his own household. Which tells me that when Jesus grew up in Nazareth, in a family of 7, with a mother and dad and a father who passed away, that Jesus grew up in a family who didn't believe in him. And he lived there with them for 30 years. Every day. And it says in verse 5, and he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And then it says this, and he, Jesus, marveled because of their unbelief. Now this tells me several things. Number 1, if you're discouraged because you have tried to be a good witness in your family, you have tried to be a good mother or to be a good dad, you have tried to raise children who were conscious of God, who knew of his presence, who appreciated who he is and who he was and who he is to be. And you tried and tried and tried. And you prayed and you prayed and you prayed. And you did it day after day after day after day. And it didn't seem like you were making any progress. Jesus gets it. He did the same thing for 30 years. And when he left his home and came back, it was the same as when he left. And it says he marveled. I think he probably shook his head and thought to himself, I can't do anything in my hometown because my people, my relatives, my family, my townsfolk don't believe in me. They don't trust me. Now, Jesus understands it's more than just biologically having kids. It's much more than that. And a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 says, I wish that everyone were like me. What is Paul saying? He's saying there that there are some situations where when you get married and you wish to have children, you can't. But the yearning and the desire to produce spiritual offspring should still be there. Just like it was in Paul, who was single. Because in all of us, there is a desire to be fruitful, to be productive, to feel like we've had an impact on somebody else besides us. And so the first purpose of family is to produce not just biological offspring, but to produce worshipers of God. And you can do that if you have children or don't. You can do that if you are single or married. Just being married doesn't automatically assume that you're going to produce spiritual children. And there comes a time in family life where you can only do so much. And it doesn't say that Jesus says, oh my goodness, this is my problem. Because it wasn't Jesus' problem. It was their problem. He had done everything he could for 30 years to live out his faith in front of his family. And when he had done it for 30 years, he left town to go into his ministry, and he couldn't answer for their lack of faith. And there comes a time in all of our lives as parents and as children when we have to understand when we walk out of our home into life, we can't be held accountable and responsible for the faith of our parents, who may be unbelievers. Or we can't be held responsible for the faith of our children who have lived under our roof all those years. Because there comes a time in everyone's life, after we've done everything we can do, being harnessed to Jesus and try to handle our families as best we can, that we have to understand God would like to do a work in your family. But sometimes they won't let it. So did Jesus waste his time? Was it a waste of his time and effort to spend 30 years in an obscure place in Nazareth with 6 brothers and sisters? Was that a waste of his time? Sometimes I guess we're tempted to think that. Sometimes we think, well, I don't know what all that was about. I don't know what all those meals were about. I don't know what all the homework is about. I don't know what all the spankings were about. I don't know what all the conversations were about. I don't know if that did any good. But you can't think like that. Jesus didn't, and we can't. Because Jesus went back and appeared to his brothers after his resurrection, and they became believers. But the 30 years in Nazareth was well spent. It just didn't happen immediately. Number 2, God is working with your family, but you need to help him. In John chapter 13, verse 34, John writes these words of Jesus. Jesus says this, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." Now that's not a new commandment, is it? I mean, that was in the Old Testament. Why did Jesus say, a new commandment I give to you? That's not a new commandment. That's an old commandment where it says you should love your neighbor as yourself. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart. And now you're supposed to love your neighbor. That's not new. But the next part is, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. Now he's talking to his disciples. So does that mean that when Jesus left home, after spending 30 years with his family, that the kind of love that he loved his disciples with was different than the love he had for his family? Does that mean that when Jesus called these men to follow him, that the kind of love he loved them with was a lot higher, a lot more noble, a lot more honorable than the love he had with his family when he spent 30 years with them in Nazareth? I don't think so. I think it's the same kind of love. The difference was that with the disciples, they responded to his love where his family didn't. He loved his dad, he loved his mother, he loved his brothers, he loved his sisters. And he tells his disciples, I want you to learn to love each other like I love you. And that's a different kind of love. Remember in the Sermon on the Mount, he says it's easy to love those who love you. What's hard is to love people who don't. So in Proverbs chapter 17, Solomon gives us a glimpse into this kind of love when he says, a friend loves when? At all times. And a brother is born for adversity. Now that's interesting. He says that a brother, when God puts a brother into your family, that brother is in your family for times of adversity. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, finally all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, which is a kind of love that's different, a tender heart, and a humble mind. So there's brotherly love that you learn as you're a brother. But the kind of brotherly love Jesus is talking about is the kind of love that he has for a family who doesn't yet believe in him. But he loves them anyway. In Matthew 19:14, Jesus says this, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven. Now listen, people, the beauty of family is that you get kids at all different ages. So you're Jesus, and you got the family to yourself. Mary, Joseph, Jesus. But Mary and Joseph understand what God said in Genesis chapter 1 about being fruitful and multiply. So they don't just stop having children with Jesus. They have another boy. Mary gets pregnant. They start talking to Jesus about he's going to have a little brother. And he's going to have to share. And he's going to have to learn to be a big brother to a little brother. And then Mary gets pregnant again. And another brother comes along. And then Mary gets pregnant again. And then another brother comes along. And then we don't know when the girls show up. But all of a sudden, there are 6 kids in the family. And Jesus is the oldest. And Mary's got her hands full. So she tells Jesus, Jesus, could you help Jude get dressed? Could you set the table? Could you make the bed? I've got all this stuff I got to do and I need some help. And so Jesus has to begin to work in the family and understand family dynamics when he had Mary and Joseph to himself. And now he's got to share with all these brothers and sisters. And because Jesus has the heart of God, he understands one of the roles of being a big brother is to hang out with the little kids, even though they are nuisances. I don't know if you've ever had a little brother or a little sister, but sometimes they hang around you at the wrong time. When you bring a girlfriend home, and they're in the same room with you, and they won't leave. Or they want to go with you when you just want to be with the big kids, and they want to tag along. And they become irritants, but not to Jesus. Because Jesus understands what a family is for. And Jesus understands brotherly love. And that's why he tells the disciples, a new commandment I give to you, that you love each other as I have loved you. And so Jesus brings to the disciples' lives, and Jesus brings to his family life, a different kind of love. Just like when you're in harness with Jesus, and you re-enter family life with him at your side, it helps you look at your family through different eyes. Now we forget about this, but do you know that during Jesus' time, getting past the age of 15 was apparently the trick? Because they've looked at and surveyed graves and cemeteries of those times, and they discovered that 2/3 to 3/4 of the graves surveyed held the remains of children and adolescents. And so a child in the time of Jesus might not live to adulthood. Matter of fact, 2/3 of them, or 3/4 of them, would die. And so Jesus might have had more siblings than even we know. And that helped families realize that death is a part of life. And I've got to learn to deal with death in my family, which is probably why Joseph passed away and God took him home. And all of a sudden, Mary and Joseph, and Mary was gone with little children, and Jesus had to help the family navigate the loss of his earthly father. And what we all need to understand is when we're in harness with Jesus and our family is dysfunctional, Jesus gets it. Now, I did just thinking about myself. Maybe you've thought about this since we've been talking about this. But let's just say for a minute that you spent 1 minute talking to Jesus about each member of your family. Okay, just 1 minute. That's not a lot of time. But let's say you spent 1 minute. Okay, and then you have how many in your family? I have Keisha, I have Mary, I have Carissa and Randy and Allison and Michael and Carla and Jim. And I've got Lynn and Bruce and their kids, Cindy and Michael and their kids. I've got Gordon, who lost his family. And then I've got my brother's family and their kids. If I spent 1 minute for each person, just talking about each person for 1 minute, do you know how much time that would take? That means that when I go to Jesus and I'm in yoke with him and I say, Lord, I need to talk to you about Cindy or Michael, or I need to talk to you about Keisha or Mary, it's going to take time to do that. And then you throw in praying for the elders and the deacons and praying for people in our church who are sick. And all of a sudden you realize that that's why the Bible says in the book of Acts that the elders gave themselves to prayer and the ministry of the word because they didn't have much time to do much else. And you realize that if we really take seriously being in harness with Jesus, we need to talk to him about the people we love the most. And you know what? It's going to take some time. So what does that mean for all of us? That means we are going to have to look at our schedules and our days, and we're going to have to find some time to talk to Jesus about what really matters. If we really want to help God work with our families. Point number 3. And this is, I wish I could spend more time on all of this, but I can't. God is building his family. And we need to understand that. And he's got a purpose and a plan that is at work in your family and everybody else's family because he's trying to build his kingdom. Now, I need to tell you something that Oswald Chambers wrote this morning in his devotion. He's talking about Elijah, who is depressed and wants to die, and he's tired because he's run a long way, and he's asleep under the juniper tree, feeling sorry for himself. And he says, and it says in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 5, that the angel woke him up. And the angel told him, arise and eat. And Oswald Chambers says, it was an ordinary thing the angel asked him to do. The angel didn't preach at him. The angel didn't fuss at him. The angel didn't scold him. The angel just said, you know what? You're hungry, you need to eat something. And sometimes in families, sometimes it's the mundane, everyday, slug-it-out stuff that we have to pay attention to because that's spiritual stuff, like eating, having a meal, having a place to sleep, having conversations. And we need to understand that God is at work in ordinary things like eating. Ordinary stuff. So listen to what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. He says, children, and everybody in this room is in that category. We all have parents, so we all qualify as children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. This is the first commandment with the promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Colossians says it this way, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. So it's interesting that he addresses children, but then he quickly goes back to fathers. He says, children, you need to obey your parents because you need to understand that they're in harness with God and that God's trying to use them in your life. And so you need to honor them and obey them because God's working in your parents to try to help you to become a worshiper of him. But fathers, don't get your kids hacked off by the way you deal with them. Now, how do you exasperate your kids? By playing favorites. By being inconsistent in your discipline. By being excessive in your discipline. By not giving them any responsibility or holding them accountable for what they do. Fathers can exasperate their kids all kinds of different ways. And Paul says, don't do it. Now, I remember one time, and I may have told you this, but we never got to see TV on Sunday night in our family because my dad was a minister. We had to go to youth group. So we never got to watch TV. And back then, that was when the good shows were on. All the good shows were on TV on Sunday night, the same time there was youth group. And the same time there was evening church. Back then, they used to have evening church. That was a long time ago, when people actually went to church 2 times on Sunday. And so we would go to church Sunday morning and Sunday night, and we would miss all the good programs. But what's worse is they were in color. And back then, a color TV was a big deal. And so we had some people in our church that had a color TV. And Bonanza was the big show back then, and it was on in color, and we never got to see it. And Wonderful World of Disney was on Sunday nights, and we didn't get to see that. We were at youth group, getting candy bars for Bible drills. So I remember one time, we were invited over to a family's home to go watch Bonanza on their color TV. This was a big deal. We were plowing new ground. We were going to their house, and it was great. I mean, we sat there in front of that TV, and things were in color. It was the most incredible thing. And I remember I had to excuse myself to go to the restroom. And I wasn't very tall back then. And so there was the toilet was there, and then there was the vanity where the sink was, and I couldn't reach the faucet with my hands, and so I thought, if I get between the toilet and the vanity, I think I can reach the faucets and turn on the water. So I squeezed in between the toilet and the vanity, not realizing that there was a big, huge shower glass door on the other side of the toilet. And when I wedged my body between the toilet and the vanity, I inadvertently dislodged the cover to the tank of the toilet. And the cover from the tank of the toilet was hurled into the glass-plated shower door. And there was this huge crash, like a huge crash, like an atomic bomb that just went off. And all I was trying to do was wash my hands. Well, now you can imagine this family that had invited us over to their home. And it was a very nice home. And here all the keys came, 5 children, 2 parents came. And so when we got invited anywhere, it was a big deal. And my parents always told us, we better behave or we wouldn't get invited back. And so here I am in the bathroom with my hands wet, looking at this shower door that is obliterated, and here come my parents. And I was so embarrassed. And I didn't know what was on the horizon for Ronnie. And I was amazed at how I was treated. I wasn't scolded, I wasn't rebuked, my parents all understood the embarrassing situation I was in, the people, the sheets, I still remember their names. They came into the shower, and you can imagine what they're thinking. Now what they're saying is one thing, but what they're thinking might be, who knows what they're thinking. So everybody gets busy cleaning up Ronnie's mess. And in that moment, I realized what a precious thing it was to be in an environment where people understood community. Where people were sensitive to the circumstances and the needs. And I still remember that to this day. And so when Paul says, don't provoke your children to anger, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. When I'm in harness with Jesus and I deal with the family, people make mistakes. And they're well-meaning mistakes. They mess up. You have to go to the ER. You have to get stitched up. It takes time out of your schedule. But that's a part of raising kids. That's a part of raising worshipers who want to serve God and honor Him. And what Paul and Jesus are trying to get across to us is to realize that God has a plan for all of us to be able to raise spiritual worshipers for Him. And it doesn't make any difference if you're married and have biological kids. It doesn't make any difference if you're married and you can't have children. It doesn't make any difference if you're single and do not have biological children. But all of us are able, because of the way God has constructed His church and the family, to raise up worshipers for His kingdom. And all of us ought to be busy doing that. We've talked about this a lot. I don't know what it was like for Jesus to appear to James after His resurrection. James, who didn't believe in Him. But that whole relationship changed in an instant. And those 30 years where Jesus had to deal with a family who just didn't embrace Him at all. Those 30 years evaporated into trust and faith and grace and love and mercy. And to Jesus, it was worth it. And I promise you this morning that all the time you've invested and spent with your family in harness with Jesus, sooner or later, He will honor them. He will. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank You so much that You use